Well, good morning, and we're doing the final part of a lecture on social research. I was going to do this as a lecture for week 3, but I've decided to just add it to week 2, where I think we can continue the discussion in a slightly different fashion in week 3. So I've called this part C of the lecture for week 2 in Self and Society. We talked already about the research basis for sociology and the way in which it's based on a range of theories and methods. Just to give you, a further idea about that, we could look at the web page for the International Sociological Association here, and we can see these are all their research committees. Down the left-hand side, right-hand side here is the themes in alphabetical order. So if you just scroll through there, you can see it's quite a broad range of things that's looked at internationally. On the other side is the numbered side, the order they came together in, I'm guessing. So just to reinforce the idea of the broadness of the discipline and the different areas it looks at, and you can click on this in the PowerPoints and have a look. And again, I said that research meant to search again, to look systematically and investigate it in relation to the social relationships that existed around whatever issue, when we walk through the basic research process. And if you read the Gurmov chapter, it does that in more detail, but just trying to outline it for you. And we talked about the importance of consent. And in this lecture, I want to start talking about some of the other issues around research, building on that notion of consent, I guess. So there's a bigger picture, I think, to ethics, and this is an interesting way to sort of talk about the other issues about knowledge and science that we need to at least touch on in this course. So there's a bigger picture to ethics, where we talked last time about the person has to agree to participate, to be clear about what they're agreeing to, and to have the right to withdraw. So what do you ask them to do, though? Why should they give you your time? I mean, if you think about it more broadly, why should they want to be involved in your research at all? They might be curious, they might be happy just to help you out. But you have to remember that as a researcher, you have an interest in the data. And if you're working for a client, for another company, then you also have an interest in that. It may be your career, it may be satisfying the client may be making money or wanted to use it for the purposes of making money, the reputation of the uni, most of which the interviewee is completely unaware. Now that may not matter very much, it may not impact on them, but the point is we're engaging in a relationship that's very one-sided, or maybe very one-sided, and so we need to think about the relationships we're having with our clients or with the people we're interviewing. And it comes as no surprise that sociologists have a particular way of thinking about that. All the scientific disciplines are concerned about ethical questions, but we're concerned about the role of people in all of this. If we go and have a look at the notion of science, I've just pulled a couple of books off my shelves here, and you can get your own environmental science or psychology textbook and have a look, but I've got earlier copies of the textbooks that you've got, but for the point of the exercise, you can say here the environmental science textbook, Botkin and Kellner, defines science as a way of looking at the world. It begins with observations about the natural world from which science formulates hypotheses that can be tested. Modern science does not deal with things that cannot be tested by observation, like the purpose of life or the existence of God. Science does not deal with questions that involve values, such as standards of beauty or issues of good and evil. The criteria by which we decide whether a statement is in the realm of science is whether it is possible, at least in principle, to test by observation. That's a fairly standard definition of science, and it goes on to have a lengthy discussion about deductive and inductive reasoning and the validity and reliability of different kinds of measurements and how to run experiments and dependent and independent variables, all those kind of ideas. We'll have a talk about some of that as well. The psychology textbook's a little bit more broader. I happen to have Kostlin and Rosenberg, which is an earlier textbook for the psych students. They're much more broader. They're much more talking here about the scientific process, the scientific method, rather than psychology as a science, although there, of course, is a debate about what psychology as a science might look like. And they talk more about the scientific method And it says, the scientific method is a way to gather facts that would lead to the formulation and validation of a theory. It involves specifying a problem, systematically observing events, forming a hypothesis of the relation between variables, collecting new observations to test the hypothesis, using such evidence to formulate and support a theory, and finally testing the theory. And then it breaks that down and has a more detailed look. So again, a fairly standard thing, a little bit more loose around the variety of methods that it accepts and the variety of approaches that it takes, but it's clearly very much in the standard scientific realm. Sociologists would have a critique of some of that. We don't think it's possible to have value-free observation. We don't think facts are just something out there to be collected. Observations aren't just there to be made. We think people work through paradigms, including mainstream scientists. A lot of them think this too. The way it's taught in textbooks isn't necessarily what mainstream philosophy of science thinks. And everybody works with a framework of unquestioned assumptions about what that makes research possible. If everything was up for grabs all the time, then you wouldn't be able to get off first base. And indeed, the Botkin and Telner textbook then begins to spell out some of those assumptions. And the idea of science as producing facts. We're very much interested in the process of production as much as the outcome. So you have that idea. The traditional scientific view of research is something which is striving for objectivity, and this is an important concept and has given science a lot of insight into how the world works, and it also has a lot of power. Its roots, of course, are in understanding nature and the natural world. As you just heard in the things I read out, a controlled experimental method where we hold all the variables fixed and try to change one in order to get a different result, so we can say, here is the causal chain. But at some level we could just think of science as bullshit detection. It's a process of falsification. It's very difficult, in fact, to know exactly whether something is true. You could always look for more evidence or gather further evidence, but in general it's much easier to know if something's false. We set up experiments and we try to falsify them. If it's supposed to be falsified, then we can say, well, now we know that that particular concept is wrong, or that particular idea is wrong, because we tested it and it didn't work out the way we thought. So there's much more of a process. But science is a important institution in our society, so we tend to look to science as sort of a truth production and has a great deal of cultural importance. So it's a good idea just to sort of bracket it off a bit and think about what that method is really all about doing. It's very reductionist on the whole. It breaks things down into the smaller parts, and this, of course, has been a very powerful method for understanding better and better, smaller and smaller things. And the issue for sociology is that process has limits, and I think if we read the latest philosophy of science, you would find that even the physical sciences are aware that these things, say particularly in environmental science, are increasingly aware of the limitations of that kind of reductionist way of viewing things. And as you heard in the Botkin and Telner text, that they're trying to get, it's value free. Science doesn't have anything to say about values and about the good and the beautiful and so on. It's about process for testing hypotheses and is seen to be value free. But I would argue that objectivity is a value, so there's a question there about how that works. There's a question in the notion of objectivity in the sense that we're treating the world as an object, as something that's out there, independent of any personal bias. Now we can make a philosophical critique about that, but the question is, for us, is that finding material causes and physical causes of objects and breaking them down to the smallest thing, and testing and replication and control groups and quantifications, even the need to be value free is a value. So those issues are a little bit more complicated than just assertions about things being value free and it being based on observation and facts. There are a whole range of processes behind that, but objectivity primarily about just treating the world as an object. As I've said, I think there are limits to that. There are, of course, straightforward forms of manipulation. There's a nice example here in the show Yes, Prime Minister, in which the head of the department is talking to the Prime Minister's private secretary about the need to do research that is to need to do a survey to justify the findings that they want to come up with. So he illustrates in quite a nice way how a survey can be used to reach completely opposite conclusions. So I'll just play that quickly. Yeah, so quite a nice example there of leading questions and the manipulation of survey results. So, there's an ethical question that is embedded in that. Yeah, so that's a simple illustration of the way in which survey results can be manipulated, and that's at a very straightforward sort of level. And of course, it's very easy to ask leading questions. It's very easy to lead an interview where you want it to go. So we need to be aware of that. The question about whether science can be value-free or any science can be value-free, I don't think it requires a lot of thinking about, just to be aware that issue isn't quite so straightforward. These issues first came up probably most prominently in science with the dropping of atomic bombs. Werner von Braun, who was a famous rocket scientist, argued that it really wasn't any concern of scientists or engineers where the bombs came down. Their job was to make rockets go up. Where they came down was no concern of science. And so when the Botkin and Talon textbook says we're not concerned about values, or the science is not concerned about values, I mean, that's a tricky line to draw in many respects. The research has to be funded. We can think of controversies around genetic engineering of food, genetic engineering of crops, and who benefits and who doesn't from that research and who's funding it. Of course, the rise of large multinational drug companies and pharmaceutical companies creating a mass market in certain kinds of drugs, the rise of chemical agriculture. Now, it's true that within a certain framework, that research may be carried out in a scientific and controlled experiment. Well, whether or not that allows us to buy out of the value-free question is more debatable. We can look at science in terms of, I think, both its critics and its supporters sometimes fall into this trap of seeing science as some sort of competition with religious explanations, that science, because it emerged in a competition with religion, was often seen as having a God's eye point of view. So there was a competition between the truth claims made by religion and by science, and often it's seen that science needs to have a God's eye point of view in order to be valid, and that's just not the case. Science is a human practice. We can never be certain about those outcomes. All we can do is assess the evidence and make some comments about what we think the evidence is telling us and what our assumptions are. I think there's a whole critique of the reductionism involved in science. Those doing environmental science will no doubt come across this kind of notion that an environmental science is much broader than the traditional disciplinary science based on in specific disciplines, as important as they are. And so even things like physics don't work in quite the reductionist way that they're often perceived as doing. There's a recognition that there are properties that are emergent that you can't deduce. If you look at the diagram down the side of the slide there, that each level incorporates the other levels. It's not a reductionist move. You can't explain chemistry by reference to the movement of atoms. Certainly, chemistry and the notion of how molecules combine depends on atomic physics and how atoms work, but they're not reducible. If you know that salt is made of sodium and chloride, well, sodium is explosive metal and chloride's a poisonous gas. And there's nothing in the atoms of those two elements that would tell you about the behaviour of salt, which is what happens when they combine as sodium chloride as salt. There's nothing in the chemistry, in the physics of the atoms of hydrogen and oxygen that would tell you about the qualities of water. Biology relies on, the biology is the study of living things, usually excluding humans at some level, and that certainly incorporates the chemistry of how molecules interact, but again you can't reduce it one to the other. Biology is not really about molecules and chemistry is not really about physics. And then the next one up, we talk about ecology, those doing environmental science, the science of how all the various living and non-living elements in an environment interact with each other, and we can talk about humans in that context and how do humans fit into that. Is there a human ecology and how might we think about that? But again, the thing is, it's not reducible to biology, and it may well be important to understand the biology of organisms, but the biology of organisms doesn't tell you everything you need to know about the ecology of a particular area, a particular environment, and it certainly doesn't tell you what you need to know about human beings, who are, I would argue, another level again, but we can have a discussion about that. So in social science we do strive for objectivity, but we're more concerned about what happens when we treat people as objects. We're more aware of the uses to which the work is put and the role of power, because that sociology sensitizes us to those variables. We look at science as an institution. We're more interested in people's experience, so we have a less reductionist approach to looking at what is going on. And psychology too has grappled with these issues in terms of how do we have a science of the mind when the mind is not visible? How do we treat people scientifically without losing important parts of human experience? In general, psychology resolved that contradiction by adopting a scientific, we call it rats and stats approach, making it a statistical exercise, doing controlled experiments. But a lot of sociology can't do controlled experiments because you can't control all the variables. If you're looking at people interacting socially, there are all sorts of variables you just can't control for. So we don't think research can be value free. I'm not even sure that, as it's traditionally understood, that value freedom is quite as desirable as it might appear if we think of it in the broadest sense. Obviously, we don't want to go out and collect evidence simply to prove our own ideas or to run a particular agenda that we've got going. But by the same token, we need to be aware that we're all players in the game, and perhaps the more we think we're independent of all of that, the more subject we are to those forces. So we can ask ourselves those questions about what our responsibilities to interview subjects. What in traditional approach of going out, collecting data, interviewing people, you leave them in the field, you come back, you analyse the data, you publish the data, and the two never interact. So the terrible things that were done for indigenous ethnographies under the guise of value-free science, they went out, they lived with the natives, perhaps they thought they were helping, learnt their language, their kinship system, and then that's gone back to a university of which indigenous people had very little concept, and someone builds a career around being an expert on this group of people, who then often the outcome, not directly from the research, but the outcome of the social changes which would lead a researcher to be there in the first place, have devastating effects, and the people never benefit very much from having been involved in those ethnographies. So we're very much interested in the qualitative aspects of research and rather than the quantitative ones, and being aware about the role of power. So that basic distinction in research that you need to get your head around is the qualitative-quantitative distinction. So it takes two forms. A quantitative research deals with quantities, with numbers, and qualitative research deals with qualities, or it's expressed in words. So just think about child development. A child goes quantitatively, they get bigger as they get older, they get larger as they get older. We can measure that in years or in pounds or in inches and centimetres. But that a child, when we're interested in child development, we're not generally interested in, babies don't just get bigger, they become, more intelligent, more interactive, more able to speak, more able to think in different ways, more able to take the perspective of other people. They go through different stages about their understanding of how the world works and what relationships they're having with people in it. So that the child is not just quantitatively different, but also qualitatively different. So quantitative research is dominated by surveys and questionnaires, of which the Yes Minister clip was a bit of a parody, I suppose. The survey data is collected through questionnaires or face-to-face or in the mail. We have a population research lab here, and I talked about the survey work we've done with the sugar farmers in relation to the mill, and also the livability survey that we've done asking people about livability and what they like about Mackay and what they don't like, and why they like to live here. And then those are subject usually to statistical analysis, and there are packages for that. I don't expect you to watch a whole lot of stuff, but if you have a chance, have a look at Hans Rosling and the Gapminder Institute. If you want to see someone who knows how to talk about statistics in an interesting and entertaining way, then have a look at this guy. I've flagged the TED Talks site. You should look at TED Talks. It's a site with short 20-minute talks about all manner of things. That usually they're nice and concise and get to the point. Rosling's a great speaker. He runs a thing called the Gapminder Institute, which has this wonderful way of presenting and demonstrating statistics. And I particularly flagged on the website the population growth question, which we looked at in the first lecture. And we have our views really of how population works in the world at present are really quite dated, and that's what he's been able to demonstrate. And he also talks about global poverty, and since we'll be talking in next week about the global structure of class and race and gender, then the little poverty thing for 20 minutes is a great little introduction to that. So numbers are important, statistics are important, and they can be very powerful tools. Quantitative research, that's what you're doing, and I'll put some examples up on the website as well about more qualitative. We just talked about quantitative research, and this is qualitative research. So you're going and you're doing an interview, you're interested in their story, you're going to guide that interview, but you're interacting with the person. You could do it by analysing journals or interviews. You could do focus groups to find out people's views. A really good one, another TED Talk to get the idea. I talked about ethnography in terms of indigenous people, but it is done in urban settings. There's a famous Chicago school of urban ethnography, and this is a very recent one, another 20-minute talk about a guy who went down. They wanted to find out about life in the urban ghettos of the United States, so a guy went down there, ended up joining a gang and being their offsider to the gang leader, and indeed at one point he made the comment that he thought being a gang leader was pretty easy, so the guy threw him the keys and said, well, you try it then. So very, very participant observation, very involved with the people you're studying. And of course that's problematic too. It's problematic too. It's not going to be research in the traditional objective observing what's going on sense, but clearly it's also able to show something about the way the world works. Sometimes one good informant can tell you more than 100 survey instruments that give you stereotyped responses. And so it's always a balance between those things. You're always trading off breadth and depth. In quantitative research, you can ask a lot of people, but for the data to be managed, you need to restrict the range of responses. Like at scale 1 to 5, do you love it or do you hate it or do you not care, in some sort of pointed scale. And is it true or false? Is it right or wrong? And you can ask 1,000 people those questions, and then you can collate the data. So it's focused on finding the pattern, and that's important. If we don't understand the pattern, then we're not going to get very far. here, we surveyed all the growers and asked them whether they voted and why they voted the way they did. In the case of that, research is carried out on the phone, so we can't have them on the phone for 2 hours to discuss it. We've got to try to restrict the variables so that we can get what we want, not spend hours on the phone, but also get the crucial things that we want to get. In qualitative research, you can be more open-ended, but the volume of the data means you can only do small numbers. If you do 25 hours of interviews for a life history, then you can't do a lot of them. I interviewed Communist Party activist. Now, to get his life on tape was about 25 hours. Now, by the time I transcribe all that, it's going to be hundreds of thousands of words, and then I have to try to edit it into something meaningful. Now, if I tried to do a history of the Communist Party that way, I would just be overwhelmed by the data. But even if you try to collate, say, all of the interviews you have been doing for this exercise, if each of you try to collate them, we'd have a fair-sized sample, about 140, 150 interviews, but the time it would take us to analyse those would be enormous, and we may want to do that. And we'd have software that could help us as well, but it's clearly an enormous task. So we're trading off all the time, and it's focused on meaning. We're trying to get to, the two sort of work together. If you can find a broad pattern, then we can go and ask, well, what does this mean? And we can only ask those questions by going and talking to people. So when we recently did work on resilience in Theodore after the floods. So, we needed to go and interview people and let them speak to identify about what they thought made Theodore a resilient town. Theodore was the town that went under two times in the big floods in Queensland. But again, we can get back to that question too about ethics. Beyond the issue of just mere consent. Have they agreed to be interviewed? Have they signed the form and they understand that they can withdraw? Okay. Now, traditional objectivist research in Theodore would mean that we would go out there, we'd collect the data, and then we would publish it somewhere about what we thought was resilient about the town. And the interactions would be restricted to our interviews with them and collating the data. Maybe we could share them with them the published article. We probably should, as a courtesy, do that. But in traditional objective research, it's much more about collecting that data in as neutral fashion as possible and then going away and analysing it and publishing it. In action research, was what we used in this project, it's much more subjective perhaps, but it is an understanding that what is going on is deepening our understanding of resilience by interacting with the people of Theodore. So we're not just interested in finding out what they think resilience is. They probably don't use that sort of terminology. We're not interested in just what is it about Theodore that objectively makes it resilient. We recognise that by going out there as researchers, we are in a position to get people to reflect on how to make their town more resilient and to be part of the process of helping them think through how to make their town more resilient. And we might go away and we'll publish about that as well, but we're actually involved in the process of creating resilience. And now that could be argued as a more subjective approach, but we argue that it's also a more ethical one. So here's a good example, another example. Research is about framing the interaction between the researcher and the body of social theory and the problem we're interested in. That's true. That's a good way of thinking about what we do research. We're bringing all those different aspects together. Our ideas, our theories, the problem that we've got in front of us, how to make Theodore more resilient, or what is going on out there. We have theories about resilience and what the main factors are. So let's go and test this sort of thing. And the result is that research is a process involving the interaction of data and theory. That's true. And I lifted that from an earlier textbook. But what you notice here, and what I've flagged at the bottom there, is where's the people in that? It's not just an interaction between theory and methods and problems. There are people involved at every step of that process. So research can be question-driven. You want to know something, someone is paying you to find out, or it can be theory-driven. You have an idea of what you want to test out and see if it explains anything. Often it's both. It's not as if we need to go to the good people of Theodore with a predefined idea of resilience. We're interested in finding out why that town is resilient, what are the factors, how does that reflect on our theories about resilience and what makes it resilience. So there's a two-way street between those things. But remember though, you're always collecting data for a reason. So the idea of sort of going out there in a value-free and observing what's going on in that traditional scientific way doesn't do justice to particularly how social theory is carried out. There's no way to do research just by observing what's there. It doesn't work that way. You collect data and you analyse using different theories and different ideas, and different schools of thought develop in especially in sociology, and we call those paradigms. So there's a functionalist paradigm, an interactionist paradigm, a Marxist paradigm that shapes the questions and the kinds of answers that are looked for. And if you go back to the earlier part of these lectures in part A, I went through a whole bunch of classic studies in Australia, and if you looked at it, you could go back. There's notes in those. I didn't elaborate them at the time, but if you go back and have a look, you can see how the theory and the data interact with each other to produce those classic studies. So one last example. We just take Muhammad Ali as an example. I got this from Matthewman, an earlier version of the textbook. We can do it quantitatively. Quantitatively tells us something important. Here is a page where his wins and losses are listed, and when they happen, there's more detail there. But we can just think about it purely as a quantitative exercise. Here I've just, he had 56 wins, 37 by knockout. There's 5 losses and no draws. So that's one way of capturing the career of Muhammad Ali in a nutshell. As a quantitative set of statistics, and then with that the web page, you can look in more detail about where they occurred, and when, and what round, and and so on. So we can add detail to that quantitative approach, but it captures something neat about why Ali was a great boxer. We could also videotape. We could look at videos of Muhammad Ali and see what they told us about him as a boxer. Here is a short sequence where he knocks out George Foreman in a famous fight sequence. Now, even though in many ways we often say that a video of something, is the most reliable form of evidence, I'm not sure that watching that video tells you very much about what makes Ali a great boxer. I mean, what can you actually see there? Whereas if we went to Norman Mailer, the well-known sports journalist and fight fan, he writes about the fight in a well-known book, and I'll just read you quickly how he describes that process in his. Within 20 seconds left to the round, Ali attacked by his own measure, by the measure of 20 years of boxing, with the knowledge of all that he had learned, of what he could and could not be done at any instant in the ring. He chose this as the occasion, and lying on the ropes, he hit Foreman with a left and a right. Into this last right hand he put his glove and his forearm again. A head-stupefying punch that sent Foreman reeling forward. As he went by, Ali hit him on the side of the jaw with a right and darted away from the ropes in such a way as to put Foreman next to him. For the first time in the entire fight, he had cut off the ring on Foreman. Now Ali struck him a combination of punches as fast as the punches of the first round, but harder and more consecutive. 3 capital rights in a row struck Foreman, then a left, and for an instant on Foreman's face appeared the knowledge that he was in danger and must start to look to his last protection. His opponent was attacking, and there was no ropes behind the opponent. What a dislocation. The axis of existence was reversed. He was the man on the ropes. Then a big projectile, exactly the size of a fist in a glove, drove into the middle of Foreman's mind, the best punch of the startled night, the blow that Ali saved for a career. Foreman's arms flew out to the side like a man with a parachute jumping out of a plane, and in this doubled over position he tried to wander out to the centre of the ring. All the while his eyes were on Ali, and he looked with no anger, as if Ali, indeed, was the man he knew best in the world, and he would see him on his dying day. Vertigo took George Foreman and revolved him. Still bowing from the waist, in his uncomprehending position, eyes on Ali all the way, he started to tumble and topple, and fall even as he did not wish to go down. His mind was held with magnets high as his championship, and his body was seeking the ground. He went over like a 60-year-old butler who had just heard tragic news. Yes, fell over all of a long collapsing 2 seconds. Down came the champion in sections, and Ali revolved with him in a loose circle, one hand primed to hit him one more time, and never the need, a wholly intimate escort to the floor. And that's a really nice piece of description, but you can't see those things by looking at a video, and you need someone who is actively engaged in that sort of process and understanding to see. And of course it takes more words though to get that out. I mean, probably took me nearly 2 minutes to read that, and the video takes about 2 minutes. But the actual event he's describing is that last few seconds of the fight when Ali unleashes that tirade of punches. And so there are lots of different ways we can understand Muhammad Ali as a fighter or the fight game, and that's just an example of how both of those are important to understanding something about Muhammad Ali. Both of them have a different objective or subjective, quantitative and qualitative sort of focus. So just reflections for this week. What ethical observations do you think we have to research subjects, to people? Is face-to-face consent enough to think about? Is sociology a kind of human ecology? So something to think about. What does the fight in YouTube show you? Could you have seen that without Mailer's description? Which is more objective and subjective? So having read or heard Mailer's description, go back and have another look and see what you can see. And I ask question is, would you be willing to participate in a quantitative research project? Why or why not? What ethical considerations should I consider before I ask you to participate? Which of course I will be a little bit later in the term. So have a think about what sorts of things I should consider. And I'll see you next week. Ta.